So here is your provocation for today.
Welcome, my friend. Welcome, my friend.
God damn, it's hot. I'm sweating like R. Kelly in Disneyland.
Welcome, my friend.
God damn, it's hot. I'm sweating like R. Kelly in Disneyland.
But I do want to go back to discuss some terminology. So just these are just some words to keep in mind or some terminology to keep in mind for as we're going through today. One is hegemony. Sometimes people pronounce it hegemony, but hegemony. And that is domination in the international context of one state over others or other regions. But hegemony really comes out of out of the idea of cultural hegemony. It's a term coined by an Italian political prisoner and theorist named Antonio Gramsci, meaning the ruling class of a given society's control over or shaping of culture. What we have so far been calling dominant culture, dominant ideologies, dominant narratives. As we think of empire, this is an important concept as many of the ruling class in America have often discussed the importance of maintaining US hegemony over the world, which is not necessarily material control, but ideological control. We can think back again to Kaplan here too, especially her discussion of that reluctant imperialist narrative. Another term we want to think about is discourse. A discourse refers to systems of thought, knowledge, and communication. In other words, the larger conversation around a particular subject. Discourse kind of assumes positions and arguments, so it's not just kind of aimless talking, but there are many different kinds of cultural objects that can participate in constructing discourse. An example from the reading, we might say that McAllister is looking at the full domain of American discourses on the so-called Middle East. What is the larger conversation being had? What shape does that conversation take? Where does it show up? And how is it expressed in culture? And just to be clear, I say so-called Middle East just because, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about Orientalism. It's a region sort of designated not by the people there, but by especially British and American discourses. So historicization, historicity. History is a narrative constructed in, by, and for the present, and so is marked by or shaped by present conditions. This is something we've returned to over and over again. As we've seen in many instances in the course so far, how we interpret, narrate, and claim histories is socially dependent and deeply political, which is not to say there is no objective fact, but how we curate, arrange, and order those facts into a coherent argument or narrative about the past is not a neutral project, at least not a politically neutral one. And again, we might recall Douglass here from What to the Slave is the 4th of July when he says we have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. We might also consider a theorist named Walter Benjamin, who tells us that history, quote, means to take hold of a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. The other term I want to introduce you to is trope, and this is sort of relevant to the provocation that you just saw. A trope is a recurring and recognizable convention of a particular style or genre. It can be a theme, a figure of speech, image, plot device, etc. Some examples: a trope in romances is forced proximity to people by virtue of circumstance or forced to share space. The tropes in YA fiction include that the main characters are often orphans. In legal dramas, in films and television, you might have noticed there's a trope of someone confessing during cross-examination on the witness stand. Like that's usually the climax of a legal drama, is the lawyer cornering somebody on the witness stand and getting them to confess. Satires often mock tropes. A satire is something that mocks something by imitating it closely. The Scary Movie franchise is an example of a satire, and it satirizes teen horror movies with their convenient nudity, Black characters dying first, people going into obviously dangerous situations to investigate, and then bad things happening to them. In the similar vein, there was films in the 2000s like Not Another Teen Movie. The Daily Show is a satire. It satirizes 24-hour or 24/7 network news shows, including their sort of fat, flashy chyrons and expert interviews, debates, and roundtables. So those are just some terms for us to think about. So Melanie McAllister's 2001 book, Epic Encounters, Culture, Media, and U.S. Interests in the Middle East Since 1945. You read a chapter from this book. You did not read the whole thing. This book comes out in 2001, but before 9/11. After 9/11, it is updated and re-released with an additional chapter. So she has been thinking about the U.S. interests in the Middle East since before the 9/11 moment. It's a long-standing tradition. McAllister's concept of cultural and political encounters. What does she mean by encounters? Well, it's not necessarily physical or material contact, but something else, something cultural and ideological, similar to Anderson's formulation about a nation being people who never meet, but in the minds of each is the image of their communion. Encounter includes imagined or constructed forms of contact. This quote comes from the introduction to the book, which you were not assigned to read, but will be useful to your understanding here. She says, thus, people in the United States encountered the Middle East through war, but also on television shows as part of the struggle over oil, but also in debates over ancient history, in discussions of religion, and also in constructions of race. This study, therefore, aims to expand the idea of encounters to include those that happen across wide geographic spaces among people who will never meet except through the medium of culture. So there's only contact through culture or cultural representation. She said there's two important factors to these encounters. One is the presence of oil and the claim to religious origins. Those are the two factors, sorry. The rhetoric of the U.S., quote, national interest in oil, representations of the Middle East, this is a quote from her, of both the ancient religious sites and the modern nations help to make the area and its people meaningful within the cultural and political context in the United States. So there's a whole polity of people that need to be convinced of national interest in the Middle East, and they do so through those two ways, through the national interest in oil and also the national interest in the religious sites of the Middle East. Official American policy, she says, toward the Middle East in the last 50 years has vacillated between two poles. Distance, othering, and containment define the first pole. Affiliation, appropriation, and co-optation constitute the second. To understand these multifaceted relationships, we must consider the politics of representation, that is, the negotiation of political and moral values, as well as the development of an often uneven and contested public understanding of history and its significance. She says, I argue that cultural products such as films or novels contribute to thinking about both values and history in two ways. First, they helped to make the Middle East an acceptable area for the exercise of American power. Second, they played a role in representing the Middle East as a stage for the production of American identities, national, racial, and religious. The two aspects were interdependent, as the construction of identities and the staging of US interests in the Middle East have often gone hand in hand. So she shares Kaplan's view that there is a somewhat symbiotic exchange between culture, identity, and nationalism, and that the US's history of imperialist expansion puts it at the heart of these relationships. Apologies, this slide we should have just been talking about. She shares Kaplan's view, or we just discussed that she shares Kaplan's view, and she also shares Kaplan's affinity for Said and Orientalism, but McAllister amends Orientalism in the US context. So Orientalism is a theory developed, and we mentioned this before, by Palestinian literary scholar Edward Said. It refers to what was originally a scholarly field whereby Western scholars would study the cultures of the quote unquote East, or what they called the Orient. These ideas put Great Britain particularly at the center of the world, and literally in terms of the orientation of the map. Because we might ask, since the globe is a sphere, east of what or west of what? It is a geographic designation, sort of, which means it is also an imagined one. But these have become utterly imagined concepts, the East and the West, the Occident and the Orient. Even now, people would describe places like Australia as the quote unquote West, but not places like Peru. So when we say East or West, we tend to be making a different distinction. We're marking a relationship to Europe, and a racial relation at that. We mean a very particular part of Europe. Orientalism, Said argues, is a colonial tendency to imagine Asian peoples as exotic, inferior, feminized, helpless, primitive, irrational, in need of colonial intervention. Early Orientalist scholars were somewhat tasked with this project, identifying the ethnic, cultural, and racial inferiority of the so-called peoples of the Orient. And they often would study the culture anthropologically, learn the languages in this sort of exoticized way. But McAllister says there really isn't the same tradition in the US, at least not in the same way. And we actually saw that with McCoy, if you recall. The military did not learn Tagalog because they felt like the language was too difficult to learn when they were occupying the Philippines, whereas the British version of Orientalism would have been to very seriously learn the language and infiltrate the culture in that way. She also says, though, McAllister says that the US's Orientalism is just not as stable as Said suggests, especially along the lines of the masculinized West and the feminized East. She says the US has imagined the Middle East as both hyper-feminized and hyper-masculinized at various times, depending on the political moment. It has also projected itself onto the Middle East. One example she presents of this projection is a particular kind of rugged white male American figure like John Wayne that we saw, and that gets projected onto the Middle East through films like The Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston. She asks an important question: why imagine Charlton Heston, the quintessential white male American hero, as Moses? What does projecting his figure do to the imagining of the identity of the Middle East and imaginings of American identity? And this is similar to Deloria here. A kind of costuming is occurring, one that performs American identity, in this case, the powerful vision of white masculinity, onto a part of the world where that ideological position sources its history. If early Americans performed Indianness to distinguish themselves from the British and tie themselves to the land, this later vision of the American man as Moses ties that identity to the birthplace of Christianity and some of its key figures. The American man thus becomes the true messenger of God. So for class today, you read the third chapter of this book, King Tut, Commodity Nationalism and the Politics of Oil, from 1973 to 1979. McAllister is tracing how King Tut, a, quote, relatively minor Egyptian pharaoh, becomes such a significant cultural icon in the United States, and all the ways nationalism and nationalist discourse in the context of the US imperialism, swirl around him as a cultural object. Reading Macalister, we should be able to mark that trends have meaning in constructing the nation, and that they are not only the products of consumer whims, but have everything to do with our material conditions, senses of history, and the broader politics of the moment. She opens with Tutmania, which was a late 70s obsession with the boy king Tutankhamun, and the traveling exhibit of his tomb. She notes that this cultural obsession happened after the oil crisis in 1973, where various global powers struggled over it, and thus Tut, she says, quote, Tut was part of a reformulation of American nationalism in the late 1970s, at a time when national identities had been severely challenged by social movements at home and declining power abroad. And the social movements at home are the civil rights movement and Black Power movements. Tut was even a big deal in terms of, wasn't even a big deal in terms of pharaohs, historically speaking, but for some reason he was a big deal to the contemporary geopolitical relations of the late 1970s. He first caused a sensation in 1922 when a British archaeologist discovered his tomb. When his tomb and its treasures toured the US 50 years later, she says, publicity for the exhibit announced that the loan of the objects for the US tour was a, quote, gift from the people of Egypt in honor of the American bicentennial. So even Americans understood the touring of the tomb to be something gifted to them for the purposes of their national greatness. The Cold War is, of course, part of it. And remember, the Cold War is the long-standing and it's the difference from a hot war in that nobody is directly fighting each other, but usually an kind of economic and hegemonic war between the Soviet Union and the socialist cause and America and the capitalist cause. And then also American allies as well and Soviet allies in the mix. Egypt's president had already loaned the exhibit to the Soviet Union, but Nixon was pulling Egypt into an alliance with the United States. So he convinces them to include one more city in the US tour than the Soviet tour, and also more objects in the exhibit than they had in the Soviet tour. Even Henry Kissinger said at the time that it was a vital part of the Middle East peace process was having this traveling exhibit of Tutankhamun. And the oil company Exxon also funds the touring of Tutankhamun's tomb through the United States. So there's a discourse of US imperial stewardship that Macalister gets into. She says the official Tut narrative as produced by museum curators, Egyptologists, and the mainstream press aestheticized the Tut treasures, constructing them as universal art, something too ennobling and too precious, too human, she says, to belong to any one people, Arabs, or any one nation, Egypt. Instead, Tut was presented as part of the, quote, common heritage of mankind, a heritage that would be owned and operated by the United States. And that's that bit about US hegemony. If there is a common human heritage, there's a common thing that all of humanity has access to, then it should be owned and operated by the United States. The Tut exhibit is curated with aesthetic but not historical features in mind. It focuses on the value and attractiveness in the objects and not pertinent history or even curation. And again, this is clear in Tut himself was not historically especially significant. The history was the frame for the art rather than the art serving as illustration or evidence of the history. This is what Macalister says. The exhibit was also structured like an archaeological dig site so that people could share in the drama of colonial discovery, and colonial discovery gets foregrounded in the exhibit, right? So it's about being a European discovering this tomb in Egypt. The Tut phenomenon, she argues, participated in the construction of an increasingly democratized subject position that was marked by the international and world historical scale of art appreciation. However, these transformations remain very much within a capitalist and nationalist model. The great nations are not defined as those that produce the great art. they are those that collect it. So this is where museums especially come into play when we're thinking about imperialism and American culture. The great nations are not defined as those that produce the greatest art. They are those that collect it or house it. And this might have been helpful. A number of you wrote about the Statue of Liberty, and you talked about it as a function of, or as representative of American greatness, but nobody discussed it as an example of French greatness. You did not see it as an example of the feats of French sculpture or the intuitiveness of French design. You see it primarily as an example or a testimony to American greatness, which is interesting, right? How those narratives work around something. The post-US war moment, 1973, we have the October War between Israel and surrounding Arab states, including Egypt. And then there's a decline of American hegemony in that context in 1973. And if you recall, hegemony being that cultural and ideological control. And then the friction between the Soviet Union and the US. And then there's a UN ceasefire deal. US puts everyone on nuclear alert. They might very well nuke people. This reaction made clear, this is what McAllister is saying, that US policymakers considered the Middle East an American sphere of influence. And we'll talk about this later, but this has very much to do with like Monroe Doctrine. Not to be left to the Soviet Union. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, puts an embargo against Israel and allies. By 1973, the US consumes 70% of all oil produced in the world, just the United States. This leads to a crisis, and the crisis leads political actors to consider more than just military imperialism, but a cultural one as well. Right? So it's not, the war stuff isn't working to bring all of these oil producing countries to heel. So Nixon employs energy consumption restrictions and a broader media campaign. Media begins constructing this as the Arab oil weapon. Political cartoons of greedy and withholding Arabs start to proliferate in American media. And you can see one of those cartoons there. So how do we imagine oil? She says Orientalist views of primitive sheikhs who don't know how to get their own oil out of the ground and the common heritage of mankind. She says, quote, the contradiction at the heart of the discourse on oil in the post-1973 period was that oil was conceived both as a universal resource and as an overpriced commodity that rightly belonged in American hands. It soon became a commonplace to point out that it was US and Western technology that made the enormous wealth of the Middle East nations possible in the first place. Commentators also noted that it was the Western nations that needed and thus appreciated that oil. As with the development of pluralistic art appreciation in the West, it was, quote, our activity that gave, quote, their resources value. So she's aligning the way the US is imagining oil with how the US is imagining the Turing tomb of Tutankhamun. And this brings us to commodity nationalism. It is where the oil crisis and Tut meet. Oil and Tut are nationalizing commodities, she says, or commodities mobilized in nationalist discourses. So Tut merch booms. Tut becomes universal and purchasable, and purchasing power as an expression of American national identity and bonding. The commodity nationalism that appropriated Tut connected to the larger logic that fused Tut and oil into a narrative of national reassertion in the face of decline, right? There was big anxiety about US hegemony declining, and so Tut reinforces and reasserts that hegemony. King Tut and his treasures become interesting in the context of deep concern about the modern Middle East and its oil. Both interests were narrated not only through the discourse of imperial stewardship and common heritage, but also through a position of Tut and oil as commodities. In these interlocking constructs, imperial stewardship and commodity nationalism went hand in hand. King Tut and the nation becomes really involved in a lot of other national narratives or counter-narratives. Black American discourses around Tut challenge hegemonic interpretations by claiming a different kind of heritage and a different kind of ownership. Egypt is in Africa, and the claim was that Egypt is in Africa, and since Egypt is African, it is part of Black history and not something universally consumable. The city of Los Angeles marks a King Tut Day in February during Black History Month. Ancient Egypt becomes a subject of anachronistic racialization. So during that era, modern concepts of race did not exist, at least the era of King Tut, and yet there is a modern battle over how we racialize those people. Are they Asian or Black? What does it mean to consign them to either? Black claims to Egypt actually begin historically with white claims to it. So whiteness is projected onto ancient Egypt elite. Scientific racism debated over ancient Egypt as well, with eugenicists and craniologists saying that the skulls of pharaohs were white, but their slaves were Black. Like literally they were arguing that the pharaohs were white, but their slaves were Black. Within these counter-hegemonic narratives, this is what she calls a counter-narrative, a counter-hegemonic narrative. The Tut treasures were marked as great precisely because they were a product of a Black African civilization, that it's something to teach the world by its particularity, not its universality. For African Americans, the ideological stakes in these two different assessments of Tut's race were clear. As the nation turned to ancient Egypt, would African Americans see a chapter of a glorious past they could claim as their own, or would they see yet another proof that great civilization was white? This process of racialization has everything to do with the modern political moment and less to do with the actual history itself. So this argument over Tutankhamun is more a product of the conditions of anti-Black racism in the United States than it really has anything to do with Egypt, with Arab nationalism, with Arab peoples, and certainly not with ancient Egypt and those cultures. McAllister also frames her argument with the clip or the scene of Steve Martin's King Tut song performed on Saturday Night Live. You can go and watch that if you get a chance. And she brings up another trope, the trope of the white Negro. Let's think again about Deloria there. She says, quote, "In this paradigm, identity was constituted through the purchase and display of style. The younger generation of white Negroes began to see itself as Black culture, or more accurately, to see itself through its own appropriation of the signifiers of Black culture." So she talks about this strange postmodern deconstruction of like the dopey white guy failing to perform Blackness as a kind of comedy because he's just too white to do it. And that's her part of her white Negro trope that she's talking about. So here's another clip as we transition to think about McCoy that I want us to start with.
I also watched this show called Cold Case Files. On Cold Case Files, they solve old murders. And it's really interesting because what I learned from it is that it was really easy to get away with murder before they knew about DNA. It was ridiculously easy. Like, what was even going on back then? What was a murder investigation like in 1935? One cop would just walk in and be like, "Detective, we found a pool of the killer's blood in that hallway." And he would just be like, gross. Mop it up. Now then, back to my hunch. Look for clues. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll draw chalk around where the body is. That way we'll know where it was. Also, a couple of years ago, I saw this movie called... I also watched this show called...
All right, so that was a stand-up comedy bit, a joke from John Mulaney. It's called Old Murders. So what's the joke's premise? He's watching a police procedural drama called Cold Case that has left him with the impression that the world was kind of lawless before the advent of DNA. It was easy to murder, and then later in the joke he talks about bank robbers, or to be a bank robber, that criminality was bold and impossible to stop in the past precisely because they did not have this kind of science. And it's funny because our modern sensibilities, we read that as a little absurd. Part of how Mulaney's joke works, and the reason people can laugh or follow along, is the shared experience of culture. Most people have seen the representations of crime and policing that he has seen. You understand the tropes or conventions of the kind of show. Otherwise, the joke doesn't work. You could be familiar with the show Cold Case, and maybe if you're not, the joke won't make you laugh. But more than likely, you don't have to have seen that exact show or the movie he references later to get what he's talking about. And that's you just don't have to because there are so many American movies and TV shows about crime and policing and the legal system that many people will still get the references he's making, even if they're not familiar with the specifics. The American police procedural is, in fact, one of the most dominant genres in the national culture and has been almost since the beginning of television. Since about the 1970s, and this is just some facts for us, about 25% or a quarter of primetime TV shows in the United States have focused on law enforcement, and this far outpaces like the number of people who actually work in that field. It's not a quarter of the American population. If television representation went by that, probably most shows would be about retail or about fast food, and even to some extent delivery. Though in the age of streaming, the notion of prime time might get lost here. So let's just say that those are the evening hours when most households with a TV would be watching it, and having a prime time slot on cable television would mean the most possible viewers and the best ratings when cable was more popular, or in fact the only way to watch television. The cultural impact of the American police procedural has really far reach. Just a few years ago in Canada, there was a protest in the country's capital against masking, vaccinations, other COVID-19 measures. And a few of the protest leaders were arrested. When they went to court, many of them defended themselves, and they defended their protests, citing their First Amendment right to free speech. The problem is that the First Amendment is the First Amendment of the US Constitution. There is no First Amendment in Canada. A kind of equivalent, we have free speech or a charter about free speech, but it would be covered in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are not subject to the US Constitution. But what the testimony of these protest leaders indicated is that the extent of the impact of American police procedurals have on everyday people's thinking. It informs much of their understanding about the system of governance they live in, even if in reality things don't really play out that way. There was a poll once about the percentage of people the percentage of people that many thought were brought back to consciousness when using CPR. They just asked people how often do you think it works, and they said they thought it worked 50% of the time. But the real answer is it's like less than 1%, because CPR is something you employ when someone is unconscious and unresponsive, which is not a good prognosis to begin with. Most respondents to that study said they couldn't tell why they thought CPR was so successful, but they thought maybe TV had something to do with it. And that's because in narrative plots where CPR is employed, it usually brings people back to life. This is one of the reasons we want to think more deeply about TV's role in the production of ideology and hegemony, because ideology is that way of viewing the world that we are confident in, but can't often locate the source of. We don't know what has brought us to these conclusions, but we are certain they are true. We can think about that John Mulaney joke here. He is confident in the premise of his joke and the common understanding of it shared with his audience, that before DNA testing, crime was easy. And there is a vision of a fairly lawless world where people are getting away with anything. But that vision he's constructed is not based on history. It's based on a fictional TV show he watched. He just accepted its premise as true. Now, police procedurals are especially focused on biological surveillance like that, particularly DNA, crime scene analysis, the science of policing. Police procedural shows in the US begin with one from the 1950s called Dragnet, which was developed in partnership with the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, for the purpose of authenticity. But in the contract, the LAPD got a stipulation that they would have full approval of all scripts. This was helpful for them at the time, as they were embroiled in several serious public cases of police brutality and excessive force. But the number one show on television was depicting otherwise. Now, that's a pretty direct form of propaganda, and by propaganda, we mean political communications or political messaging, often colloquially called copaganda. But there's a broader cultural studies approach to this question of policing in television, one that a scholar named Derek S. Denman takes up. He has a paper on what he calls the copaganda cinematic universe, where he considers the law enforcement procedural television show as a genre, but also as a cinematic universe unto itself, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where characters all live in the same world by the same rules, and stories can intersect or resemble each other. But they don't have to be uniform or deeply connected. The point is the part where the world they collectively depict is clearly governed by the same set of rules and with the same set of expectations and often the same set of outcomes. Denman says the copaganda cinematic universe creates a few key sets of hegemonic ideas. And he also says that this relationship between police procedurals and actual police departments has remained for a long time. They still normally have control over scripts, and especially shows involving the FBI and CIA definitely have full control over scripts. He says it does a few things and sets for hegemonic ideas, normalizes regular contact with the institution of policing as a kind of natural part of the social order, rather than something that should be infrequent, and rather than something that is socially constructed and thus changeable. So the idea is that it's sort of not even something made by people, it just always exists. And one of the reasons he says that this works is that he says the police exist in, quote, every imaginable iteration of the world, including fantasy and horror worlds. So that works to really naturalize it, not as something man-made, if you will, that can shift, but as something that's as natural as the sun. It also produces mythologies, and it produces a police subject. So people become accustomed and acclimatized to being surveilled, or like the techniques of surveillance, as well as accustomed to forms of extrajudicial violence. So you'll see in the show, the cop will turn the camera off and beat up the bad guy, or he'll violate some other law or rules. But so long as the bad guy is bad, and so long as we understand him as the main character, we get what he calls enchanted by the spectacle of the show. And that helps normalize that behavior. And then the audience becomes used to thinking that they don't see that as a violation of constitutional rights. They see that as a necessary and important feature of policing. So the necessity of policing or state surveillance, especially in the lives of everyday Americans, it's depicted as this natural and permanent feature of the American social life and cultural objects like film and television, but that is at odds with its historical origins and development. As Mark Lamont Hill told us about prisons, modern policing too is a relatively new phenomenon, and yet has an incredible hold on the American imagination. Though some early forms of law enforcement, like those in the Holy Roman Empire, they might resemble superficially modern policing, but what we would recognize as police and policing today is not descended from those forms. It is really a 19th and 20th century invention and phenomenon. One formative aspect of the modern American surveillance state's history and policing that is deeply related to our question about culture and imperialism is its historical relationship to imperialism and expansion. In the John Mulaney joke, he has some fun at the expense of DNA, but DNA was not developed for the purpose of policing. It was scientifically deduced personal biomedical information, and it was searched for and discovered for the purpose of solving the mysteries of genetics and various diseases. And yet today, when we say the word DNA, we will often conjure in our minds images of detectives or crime scene investigators. Recent developments in DNA genealogy testing have led police to use DNA from ancestry test companies to locate suspects, through distant family relatives, and advancement of policing's reach, which is an advancement of policing's reach into the private sphere. Legally, police cannot collect your DNA without a warrant, but DNA is genetic material, and they can collect parts of your DNA through others if those others give their permission. The tradition of police turning personal biomedical information into technologies of surveillance and enforcement, like in the Mulaney joke, the detective collecting blood to solve a crime, or he mops it up, he doesn't collect it. But McCoy tells us its origins are actually in the early colonial constabularies developed during the American military occupation of the Philippines. The reading from McCoy's book that you were assigned, and McCoy's book is called Policing America's Empire, the United States, the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State. It is an enormous book. It is like 900 pages. He documents literally everything. But he says the Philippines and the U.S. have had a long history. No other nation has felt the force of American power so closely, so constantly throughout Washington's century-long rise to world leadership than the Philippines. There's some important points, historical points and concepts. So the Monroe Doctrine comes about in 1823. No European, which the Monroe Doctrine is like no European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere, or it means war with the U.S. It's a position on foreign politics and foreign interference that the U.S. holds. So that's what leads to the Spanish-American War of 1898. The U.S. After that war takes from Spain the territory of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and sort of Cuba to some extent. The Philippine-American War happens immediately after 1899 to 1902, and that is when the U.S. crushes Philippine national revolutionaries looking for independence, and then the Philippines becomes an official U.S. territory, and that's because there was already a war for independence that the Philippines was fighting against the Spanish. But when the U.S. defeats the Spanish, they take over the Philippines, and the Philippines are saying, no, we want no colonizers. And so then the U.S. crushes their movement for national independence. And once the Philippines becomes a territory of the United States, it is an exact same place as Puerto Rico is, and governmentally. So until 1946, people from the Philippines had U.S. passports and were considered non-citizen U.S. nationals, again, similarly to Puerto Ricans. This occupation leads to the creation of sophisticated modern policing, and it was crucial to the U.S. pacification of the Philippines. That's what McCoy tells us. He says this is due to an aspect of imperialism sometimes called the boomerang effect, but McCoy calls it the capillaries of empire. The metaphor is apt. Capillaries are small blood vessels that transport blood to and from your tissues. And he says empire also transits or transports things to and from the colony outpost and the metropole. So that which is produced in the empire eventually makes its way back home. He says not only did colonial policing influence Philippine state formation, but it also helped transform the U.S. federal government. Indeed, security techniques bred in the tropical hothouse of colonial governance were not contained at this periphery of American power. Through the invisible capillaries of empire, these innovations percolated homeward to implant both personnel and policies inside the federal bureaucracy for the formation of a new internal security apparatus. So a little bit of terminology. Again, what is a state? McCoy leans on Max Weber's definition, which is, quote, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. This is an important definition. It's much like Benedict Anderson's definition of the nation, it's kind of the definition of what a state is that's roundly accepted by most academics, or by many academics, I should say. We might often hear a phrase like, there is no place for violence in America, or people saying such things, but that's sort of fundamentally and objectively untrue. There's place for violence. There's just no place for illegitimate violence. So Weber's claim is that the state is the entity that has a full monopoly, which is to say full and sole ownership over the legitimate means of violence. The state can perform violence on people exclusively, and violence committed by or between non-state actors, meaning people, is only legitimate if the state says so. So via the courts, for instance, like they say, you did that in self-defense, it was okay, it was a legitimate means of violence. Policing is one such form of legitimate violence, or a legitimate form, a means of violence. And that's the enforcement part of law enforcement. And the police are a state entity. And then again, when we think about the state here, we want to think about Anderson's term sovereign, right? It's the state is sovereign. It can both make and break the rules. It determines who can use violence and who cannot. McCoy tells us that the modern state is special, though. It leans less on the sort of brute enforcement of years past, of the empires of old, and now does most of its enforcement through a sophisticated system of surveillance. That is the surveillance state. That is what he calls the surveillance state. And that begins for him with a couple of things. It begins with an information revolution and then a colonial laboratory by which to work out that structure. So first, technology needs to get up to the point where they can make a surveillance state, and then they need to test it out in a colonial laboratory, which in this case will be the Philippines. The information revolution in the US is a series of technologies and data management systems that make the quantification and organization of mass amounts of information possible. He reminds us, in just one decade, we get the telegraph, the typewriter, the telephone. In the very next decade, we get photography, calculators, early computers, as well as systems for classifying and organizing information, like the Dewey Decimal System. He says domestic policing itself is slow to catch up, but it does so through colonial experimentation. So fingerprint identification, for instance, is developed by the British in colonial India. So as the British colonized India, they developed fingerprinting as a way of surveilling the resistance and rebellions of Indian people, or people from the Indian subcontinent, we should say. And criminal records are invented by Scotland Yard, involving the British occupation of the Irish. Both of those things get adopted by the US's early version of the FBI. And the US figures out the US invention in all this was a system, or how to communicate and network all of that information together. The Americans' genius to rationalize data management inside those same institutions, right? So previously, identity and stuff was just the government, like that's the administrative state. But the American innovation is to put all of that identity information, all of that categorization inside of the same bodies of enforcement, and so that they can put all of it together. Now, I think one place that McCoy falls short, historically speaking, is that he kind of fails to make an important historical connection on the domestic front here. He notes that policing transforms in the US after 1865 and says this is because of growing cities primarily, like these growing cities make these networks possible. That is true, but 1865 is also the year that slavery is abolished, and the expansion and development of modern domestic policing in terms of information at that same moment is not a coincidence. So some of these technologies are the background that make the US surveillance state and modern policing possible, but the US is not a full surveillance state until the late 19th century. And because it hasn't quite, what he says, penetrated the private sphere. It really developed deep systems of spying on or collecting information on everyday citizens, nor reasonable justifications for doing so, right? So like most people would just not be okay with that. Remember, the nation is relatively young and still deeply attached to notions of liberty and privacy. Those notions will get broken down over preceding years, primarily through the construction of the enemy or the other. Already, policing has advanced in the aftermath of slavery. Slave catchers and now, thanks to the carve-outs of the 13th Amendment, ongoing methods for re-enslavement and containment of the Black population. But as we've seen with Nye, a developing relationship to new forms of the national other, the immigrant, the political dissident or rebel, a nation born of revolution begins to imagine itself it begins to reimagine its relationship to rebellion and revolution so that it might contain them. Revolutionaries and political dissidents need to shift in the cultural imagination from being heroes to being enemies of the state and thus the nation. We saw this too with Douglas's argument, if you remember. He tells those who were arguing that abolition of slavery would be an affront to tradition or would destabilize the nation. He says that those were the exact same arguments that their forefathers made against the Declaration and War of Independence. He says they sound more like British loyalists than they do American patriots when they make those arguments. In dominant narratives, the only good revolutionaries are those far enough in the past that their radical ideas are no longer seen as radical. So another thing that pops up is the Bureau of Investigation, which will become the FBI. And it's established in 1908 under Theodore Roosevelt. I actually think this is on the previous slide. It's not. But then how under Theodore Roosevelt, and it's precisely with the aim of containing domestic labor activists and also migrant threats. That's the invention. And if you think of 1908, that's around the year that we get those first immigration restriction laws. So they have the technology, they just need the laboratory. In comes the imperial military pacification of the islands, the experimentation of the Philippines islands, the experimentation of those military commanders on surveilling and suppressing the resistance of the people of the Philippines. The Military Intelligence Division produces some important figures. The key one that McCoy brings up is Captain Ralph Van Diemen. In one of history's accident, the Filipino flair, this is a quote from him, for counterintelligence and the American appetite for information combined to create an advanced form of military espionage that fused combat intelligence and political surveillance. The U.S. Army applied its advanced data management techniques to counterinsurgency through a complex of new security forces, the Manila Metropolitan Police, the Philippines Constabulary, and its own division of military information. So he explains how the system comes about. The Spanish had already set up a kind of structure of local policing, a constabulary, and the Americans have their military there. The American soldiers, they're like, Tagalog is too hard to learn, so they don't learn the language, and they instead rely on local constabularies, getting local people to try and subdue each other and inform them what's going on. This is really the birth of modern policing, which is the idea of having people's own people instead of a military occupation, which people keep fighting. They're very resistant to, but they're more likely to be less resistant to people they recognize as their own. Also, the Philippines was having Asia's first ever anti-colonial national revolution. So the revolutionaries were sophisticated in their counterintelligence, and that forced America to get better at surveillance and control than perhaps its other colonial and imperial counterparts like Great Britain in a much shorter amount of time. The Philippines, they had been fighting for their independence for some time, and so they had really sophisticated structures of espionage. And so the US had to come up with some surveillance themselves. They laid a ton of cable lines, they built information infrastructure, this is the American occupation, and they deputized locals to police each other while reporting back to the top in exchange for pay and limited power. And this is where it leaves us. He says the Philippine Revolution represented 2 generations of political transformation, starting with the invention of a Filipino national identity, articulation of a political program for its realization, and mobilization of an army in its defense. Washington's decision to colonize the country plunged its soldiers into a sustained campaign to reverse these revolutionary processes. First, a short, bloody war against the Philippine Army. Next, a harsh counterinsurgency to crush its guerrilla forces. And finally, a protracted secret police operation to demoralize the radical leaders and discredit the nationalist ideas that had been their inspiration. But the colonial surveillance state boomerangs. Any empire makes its metropole more self-conscious. And remember thinking about, we talked about the suspicion, that culture of suspicion, makes its metropole more self-conscious, more calculating in the application of power. This is something that McCoy tells us. The leaders of the Philippines colonial occupation, so the soldiers who were involved in it, they returned back to the US in the time of World War I, and they set up massive domestic and international surveillance apparatuses. Captain Van Diemen returns home to expand military intelligence. He was leading this colonial occupation, and he's a doctor. And that skill played into how he expanded surveillance in the Philippines. One of his major contributions was developing big dossiers on people, including all their private information and secret vices that could be used to threaten and coerce them later. Since he was in the medical field, the things he thought to collect included medical and dental records. These became the early forms of collecting biometric data on civilians, like DNA, like fingerprints. He is a major reason why this happens, and it's kind of an accident. He's a doctor. It's what he thinks to look for. But importantly, he and others brought back with them more racialized forms of policing, the suspicion and targeting of political dissidents and ideas about the criminality and biological inferiority of immigrant populations, especially those from Asia. These were ideas infused in advanced domestic policing in the United States, evolving into what it is today. The dossiers also become important for a particular style of American imperialist dominion over the world, right? In contrast to the British, who relied on that strict rule-following bureaucracies and the Orientalism of like study and studying culture, the US relied more on coercive market control through capitalist relations and the delegitimizing the insurgent governments of new nations with webs of information. So scandals, they would plant, the CIA especially is big on planting scandals. And then again, most importantly, the MID that Van Diemen expands upon when he returns during the World War I era. So he gets a promotion when he comes back to the US. That lays the groundwork for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and that eventually becomes the CIA. So he goes, experiments in the Philippines, figures out this dossier collecting, biometric collecting. And when he comes back, he starts what will eventually become the CIA. So McCoy's work traces these capillaries of empire from their roots in the colonial laboratories abroad back to their incorporation into the domestic systems. What was first aberrant and unacceptable domestically, like big government is not supposed to spy on you, American liberty and privacy is like really held in high esteem. That what was initially aberrant and you would not have convinced local citizens, it gets brought in this racialized order from the colonial constabularies after it has been perfected on the colonial other and then returned home, and then it's normalized using similar means, right? So then initially it's only deployed against people of color, so white populations are less concerned about it, but then it slowly just becomes regular and normative through a lot of cultural products like the television shows that we watched or that we've been discussing. To return to Mulaney, to that Mulaney joke, it is fundamentally about the technological advances of policing in the US, including that collection and management of biological information. And that includes photo identities, DNA, and then naturally, some of that technology was first introduced through this means. And as Mulaney indicates, he came to appreciate the modern state and its ability to surveil and capture through its representation in film and television. He thinks, well, the world must have been lawless before then. It must have been very funny. He doesn't necessarily view it as an imposition or something impinging on privacy. So that brings us to our critical questions. You've got a few that you can use as an access point. So what shows or films would you count as part of the surveillance state cinematic universe if you had to make up such a thing? Or what cinematic universe would you say The Provocation is depicting? Like, what's that cinematic universe? If you recall to the TikTok video. Can you think of other examples of commodity nationalism, as McAllister defines it? Other ways of like purchasing merch is a way of performing one's nationalist ideas. How are the encounters of empire and the capillaries of empire similar as McAllister and McCoy described them? How are they different? That's it for today. Next time, we are talking about Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun. We're starting with chapters 1 through 13, and week 14, we will be looking at chapters 13 through 20. That's it for today. I will see you all next week.